So we're going to look at another type of simple machine, which is a lever. And levers are something you're pretty familiar with. And like all machines, they allow you to do some work with less force, but it takes a longer distance to move through. So it's not always obvious how a lever does work, especially when you consider things like seesaws. So let's look at this as an example of a seesaw. And I think we can see if we put a weight on here, that's going to move down. Now let's say we want to lift that weight up in the air. We can apply a force here. And if we apply a force here, the weight will move up. But we can make that work better by shifting the pivot point. So if we move the pivot point closer to the weight, okay, and I hope you can see now, this is much, much higher up in the air than this is going to be when it's finished. If we put the pivot point there and move it, it now takes less work. We have to apply less force to get it to move, but this end moved through a greater distance down than that end moved up. Okay, and you'll sometimes see levers when you're looking at balancing. So this one here, if I just move it along a bit, this mass is twice as heavy as this mass, and I can balance things with different masses on them by shifting the pivot point. Okay, and this is another way of looking at how the weight force of this can still balance the larger weight force of this mass here, just by changing where the pivot point is and changing the distance that it has to move through. So we're pretty familiar with levers. We know heaps of different types. Seesaws are one type. A seesaw has the pivot in the middle, and it has the load at one end that you're moving, and it has the force at the other when you're moving it down. Hammers are a type of lever. When you're hammering something in, you're either moving it at your wrist or at your elbow, or if you're really into it, at your shoulder. And so those become the pivot points. So if I'm just using my wrist like that to just tap something, I've got all this length of the lever applying a force here onto something like a hammer, into a nail into some wood. Or you can, an axe we commonly call a wedge, but it has a lever component to it too. It's not like you're just holding the head of the axe and tapping it into the wood. You're actually moving it in a lever action to get it into the wood. So you can use the other end of a hammer as a lever too, and this is how you can use this for crowbars as well. You'd push that into the head of the nail, and as you turn it, you're applying a force up here, a force in this direction. That's causing a force to lift up on the nail, and here's the pivot point at the head of the hammer. So there's heaps of different types of levers. Wheelbarrows is another one, and in that case, if we imagine that this is our wheelbarrow, we apply the force at this end, the loads in the middle, and the pivots at the other end. So depending on where the pivot points, we call those different classes of levers, and you can find out more about them if you want. The important thing to remember, like any simple machine, a lever lets you do work with less force, but if you want to use less force, you have to move through a greater distance to do so.